We're here today at NEF, meeting with Tony Greenham.
And we're hoping to talk about potential collaboration between NEF and EIO. I see how agendas can link.
Maybe just getting some of his views on how this fits in with some of the steady state economics that they're putting forward. And we'll see what happens, really, and take it from there.
I suppose really what we're trying to do is ultimately harness the power of that system, financial system, and then use it to actually create an incentive mechanism to change the behaviour of corporates. So I suppose really it kind of comes in two distinct parts, one being the carbon rankings. But I quite like the way you sort of put that, which is rather than perhaps naming and shaming, shining or sort of creating a race to the top, which I suppose is really what that's all about. And there, ultimately what we're trying to do is encourage, first and foremost, disclosure. Then once you're disclosing, that's brilliant, but is it verified? And then ultimately looking at carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions intensity. But then really the real crux of the actual concept is to then use that ranking to form the basis of a series of tradable indices, or indexes. So the idea there being that what we're doing is trying to offer the investment community a tool to apply this pressure, which is hopefully palatable to them because it's mainstream enough to be very similar to what they're doing already with, for example, traditional stock market indexes like the FTSE 100 or the S&P 500. So the way we've designed it really is to still include all of these companies, but then to reweight half of them positively on a sliding scale and the other half negatively on a sliding scale as well. The logic being that if we can get enough investors to follow them, and hopefully we can because of the way they've been designed to have the same risk reward, then we can actually start to change the supply and demand for those companies' shares and ultimately influence their share price. Then that company that's raison d'etre is to make money for its shareholders has a new kind of mindset perhaps inserted into the way it operates. And I suppose where we're at now is we've launched our first set of rankings this year, trying to launch another set in February, and then the next step will be launching the indexes about a month later, and getting the investment community to hopefully at least take a look at them and sort of say, well, you know, if what I've just explained to you does make sense, then surely this is something that perhaps we should consider.
Well, I think it's it's a very sound approach because it as you say, you're working within the existing institutions, and you're also working really within conventional economic theory, which recognises that prices exclude lots of information, and most importantly, perhaps, they exclude the price of environmental pollution, which is what climate change is, I suppose. And so, in order to make a market work effectively, you've got to get that information into the prices. So you can do, so that's the carbon tax theory, isn't it? So you could say, well, hit those companies by getting the price of carbon right in their operations. But I quite like this approach because in a way it's less complex. Because what you're doing is you're changing the cost of their capital. You're pushing up the cost of capital for the carbon intensive or relatively, or carbon inefficient, let's say, companies, and lowering the cost of capital for the carbon efficient companies. And I think that's actually a simpler and potentially very powerful mechanism.
Well, the other side to that, I suppose, is that what we're really trying to do is just to create a kind of dynamic pressure across the board and throughout the entire economy, so that each company, whatever its operations, is experiencing a constant pressure to ultimately be reducing its emissions.
Yes.
So that does also simplify somewhat. I suppose that's possibly an interesting thing just to touch on to perhaps get your views. One of the potential criticisms, if you like, of especially the rankings, when taken just as the rankings, is that we are not actually looking specifically at different sectors, we're putting everybody together.
Yeah. I think really my answer to that criticism is, that's a fair point, but the way this is set out is it's something that's actually doable. Because the problem with trying to assign carbon to ultimately to the sort of decision maker whose fault it is the carbon's being consumed. It's just that you get overwhelmed by complexity. I mean, I think it works because precisely because it's a ranking mechanism and it's relative and it's dynamic. So if you can't work out whether Marks and Spencer's carbon intensity is good or not compared to BP's, because actually that's apples and oranges and it's not a sensible comparison, you at least can compare Marks and Spencer's to Next and see who's doing better and ask the question why. Maybe there are good reasons to do with their operations, but at least it starts. And then the second thing, of course, you can do is see whether they're improving over time. So as long as you're creating the downward pressure on emissions in their businesses, then it's doing its job, as far as I'm concerned. And these sort of finer questions of, well, is it fair to compare that with that at this point in time, is much less relevant to, well, maybe it isn't, but at least we can now know who's improving and you know, who relative to their close competitors is better. I'm quite interested as to whether you've modelled historic indices using the historic data to see how the indices that you're constructing would have performed over the last 5 years.
We did.
Yeah.
I'm afraid it only went back as far as 3 years.
Well, that's
But basically, extremely close correlation. I mean,
Right.
there's pretty much 2 lines neck and neck. What we also looked at was a kind of, so not actually as well as the specific past performance data, just to create a model to actually sort of say, well, what would happen in some sort of worst case scenarios. And really, I suppose what it comes down to is that if you are overweighting half of them and underweighting the other half, you'd have to have some pretty unlikely statistical patterns to see all of the ones that you've overweighted do particularly badly and vice versa. Just to maybe put a question back to you on that note, I mean, how attractive do you think that proposition would be if we're saying to people, okay, so at the moment you're investing in your standard FTSE 100, you can do exactly the same thing, get the same returns, same risk, and tackle climate change.
Depends what the motivation is. Some people will say, oh, I quite like the idea of not losing out financially, or even running the risk of losing out financially, but still feeling I've got a green investment. And what's interesting about this concept is that what you're saying to people is, don't screen companies, remain invested in them all, which gives you some leverage over them. But at the same time, you can send a signal to them.
Well, I mean, that's precisely it.
Yeah.
And also, I suppose, the idea that hopefully the company itself, this is, again, it kind of comes back to this idea of scale. If you can get, say, 10% of the index market following these indexes, then that means that company knows that it's going up the rankings by, 100 places, is going to boost that weighting. Even if we've only got 0.01% of that market, that's creating a pressure that wasn't there before, and to some extent is sending out a message, especially coupled with the rankings and the dynamic nature of them. Sort of, what would be your reaction to that in terms of thinking about scale?
I mean, the sort of thing that that I used to do as a corporate broker is phone the finance director and say he'll want to know why the share price has gone down 2% today, and I'd say, well, unfortunately, so and so at Aviva, they just changed the fund manager of that fund, and he doesn't like retail, so he's moving his weighting from retail into something else, and that's why his share price has gone down, because he's actually sold 500,000 of his shares today, and it actually this swings around those almost individual transactions. I come back to what I was saying before, that you have to seek things which you can actually do, and so the fact that this doesn't do everything is not a reason not to do it. So we'd love to have a mechanism where you could not just have a measure of environmental performance in carbon emissions, you could have a measure in, social justice and a measure in well-being, but you can't.
Or not at this stage.
Not at this stage. So that's not. If you waited until you had the perfect solution, then nothing would ever happen. So
very, very, very helpful for us, and really great to get you.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking
Thank
to you.
you very much.
Yeah, and thanks for coming to
Cheers.
tell me all about it. I look forward to being involved in it.